Hi, everyone. So I'm Corinne Guimont. I'm a digital scholarship coordinator at Virginia Tech, and I'm also a part of Virginia Tech Publishing, our publishing services unit in the library here. I'm going to talk a little bit right now about creating a publishing preservation policy, and let's go ahead and dive in. So what I'll go over here is we'll talk about why is it important to create a policy? Why did I choose to do so for us? What we publish, and maybe think about what you publish, and then the actual process I went through for creating the policy, and then what the next steps are now. So why create a policy? I'll go ahead and I'll start with why I created a policy for us. So at the 2019 LPF in Vancouver, I attended a presentation on preservation for library publishing. And it kind of got me thinking, what do we like, what are our practices around preservation? We publish a lot of materials. What happens with them? Theoretically, they're all preserved. People like to throw out acronyms like AP Trust and clocks and locks and all sorts of stuff. But what's actually happening? So I started talking a little bit with our digital preservation coordinator in the library. Her name's Alex Kinnaman, and just trying to figure out what's going on there. Even after talking to Alex, some of that stuff still felt muddy. So I was thinking a bit about, okay, how do we do this? And I was going to dive in and actually create our own policy. But then, probably like most people, COVID happened, 2020 came around, we all went into pandemic, and it was kind of just pure survival mode. So those kind of back burner projects like this went on hold. But then there was an opportunity for LPC members to join the NASIG Digital Preservation Model Policy Group, which I did join and was able to kind of dive in there. That really helped me kind of get my head around what a policy would even look like. I also got to, while working on that model policy, I looked a lot at other policies, and that was incredibly helpful in thinking about all of that. And then using that model policy as kind of why anybody should create a policy, I've pulled a couple of quotes directly from there. So a preservation policy might help articulate the scope, activities, and principles that support digital preservation of materials. And it also might ensure that the preservation activities are repeatable, visible, and transparent to stakeholders. So really making sure this document, it might be a short document, ours is only 4 pages that I'll show you here in a little bit, but that it's kind of providing that scope, that information, and just making sure that those activities are clear and understandable, so that when somebody like myself goes and asks questions, it's pretty straightforward. So diving into what we publish here at Virginia Tech, we publish a wide variety of things, books, both student book projects as well as faculty books, journals, again, student journals, as well as journals edited by faculty either on campus or outside of there. Lots of OER. We have a pretty amazing OER initiative here. We've done some papers and reports that are kind of one-off, a little bit shorter than a book, but not quite a book. So we kind of call those papers or reports. And then we do a lot of digital humanities projects. This is actually my area. I started working on how to preserve digital humanities projects with Alex, our digital preservation coordinator, long before I even dove into this policy. So that was kind of already a back burner area for me. And then last but not least, we also have some podcasts and other media projects that have been growing in the past couple of years. So lots of materials there. And then I also started thinking about the platforms that we use for publishing. So we use Ubiquity for all of our journals and some books as well. We use Pressbooks for a lot of our books, a lot of our OER. And we also use Pressbooks both as a tool to view the books. So we have a lot of OER in there that's public through Pressbooks, but then we also use it internally sometimes as a typesetting tool. So for a lot of our student book projects specifically, the students will put all of the material into Pressbooks and then export the PDF and EPUB, which then goes on our website, and we'll send to Kindle for print on demand. And then for a lot of our DH projects, we have some smaller projects that are use out of the box technology like Omeka, Scalar, and WordPress. Some of those are hosted locally in the library, but then we also have a domain of one's own program where some of those are also hosted. And then with other DH projects, but then also with our media and our podcasts and even some of our book projects, there are other custom tools and workflows that we follow that create all types of files, either very complex files like code, HTML, stuff like that, all the way down to some more simple files, just LaTeX or PDF files. So after I kind of dove into what we were actually publishing, what platforms and tools we were using, I then took a look at how to actually create the policy. So again, I started with that NASIG digital preservation model policy and kind of built the outline from there. And I'll go ahead and hop over to that tab really quick. So this is the NASIG digital preservation policy, and you can see there's a whole table of contents, how to use the policy, all that. But I skipped down to directly where they started. We started outlining the sections that your policy might have, and I stole or borrowed a lot of those sections from this policy directly. So we have an introduction, the principles, a bit of scope, specific preservation activities that might be carried out, some roles and responsibilities of who might be involved in all of this, some collaboration, some framework and administration, and other related documents and a glossary. So kind of stealing some of that skeletal structure from there, that's what I used to begin to outline what our preservation policy might look like. Once I had that outlined, I was able to start asking myself questions of what do I need to fill this in order to start filling out some of those sections. I then went to any existing documentation we have. So our department specifically has a guiding philosophy and strategy document that kind of outlines what are our goals with publishing, what are our values, our vision, all of that fun stuff. And I used a lot of that to think about, okay, how do our goals and our values help guide our preservation activities, and how does that help us decide what we're preserving and what not. I also started talking to people. So obviously I first started with our publishing team. I had a conversation with them, made sure that I was hitting all of the right areas that I was thinking of everything that we were doing. And then we talked a bit about, okay, within our publications, what are we preserving? Do we want to preserve our contracts, our MOUs? Do we want to preserve comments from peer reviewers, any communication with authors, all sorts of stuff like that. And we really had a good conversation about that. And like I mentioned, I also worked a lot with our digital preservation coordinator, Alex Kinnaman. She's fantastic. She even helped me write some of the policy to make sure I was using the right language and everything. And to help me know what we're even doing and if I'm actually even writing out the right things. And then also I worked with our vendor, specifically in this case, Ubiquity, to see kind of what preservation activities, if any, they were following out with the content that we had deposited with them. So now we can go ahead and we'll just take a look at our policy. And I'm just going to hop to this tab, but there's a link there in the slides as well. And I'll scroll all the way to the top to get started. So again, I tried to keep this short. It's around 4 pages. I wanted something that was easily digestible for both future me as well as other future people in our department that might take a look at this. And I mostly followed the sections outlined in that model policy document. Starting with our introduction, the introduction really kind of outlines what this document is for, why it's created it, when it was created, all of those basics. And then moving to our principles, we have our foundational principles and our operating principles. Some of these I literally borrowed from that model policy. Others I kind of adapted from our existing documentation. But really thinking about what are the reasons that we're preserving this material, and using that and making sure we document those reasons for preserving those materials. So that way, 5 years from now, when I revisit this, I remember, oh, this wasn't just a how-to document. There was a reason behind this. And then also, even not just for future me, but also for other future folks who might be in this department. And then looking at scopes, this is where we really kind of dove into what are we preserving, what are we not preserving. We really wanted to think about, yes, we want to preserve those final publications or projects, but also thinking about the pieces of those publications. So maybe that's the publication text, if it's especially for a DH project where that might be embedded within a website, we want to preserve that text elsewhere, or for an OER, if we want that like editable files of the text and those preserved so that people in the future could maybe adapt and reuse that content. Any embedded content that might be in the book or publication that includes video, images, other media. And then obviously our metadata, we want to think about our descriptive metadata, our technical metadata, and then also our administrative metadata, specifically the intellectual property rights. Also thinking about again, this goes to my DH side, those data sets, when those are available from our authors and our researchers, how can we preserve those, and how do we best go about doing so? And then thinking about our contracts, our MOUs, all those publishing agreements, to make sure we're keeping kind of a record of, especially things that include copyright and intellectual property rights. We also decided as a team that it would be helpful to preserve those peer reviews, just so we had those comments moving forward and maybe why a decision was made. Some things that we're going to consider a little bit further are, do we want to preserve earlier drafts? Would there ever be a case where we might want to preserve earlier drafts, or are we really going to focus on just those final publications? And then, is there any reason that we might want to preserve any annotations or comments? What we decided we don't want to preserve is any promotional materials, any emails or ads or anything like that that we might be sending out in relation to any specific publications. And we also don't want to preserve any communication with our authors. Obviously, we might hold on to that for the short term, but long term, we don't want to use our space for those things at this point in time. And then this next section is kind of diving into those preservation activities. This was the section that I really worked with our digital preservation coordinator on. She helped me kind of outline and make sure that everything was written correctly. We also chose to include links to existing documentation, whether that be at Virginia Tech or through the organizations that we partner with for preservation, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. If there's documentation that already exists, let's just reuse as much as possible. No need to rewrite things that are already written. And that also is helpful. So if the documentation changes, or if any processes changes, that's just a direct link to this document versus kind of going back in time. And then this next section is roles and responsibilities. So obviously, like I said, I talked to a lot of people when writing this. There's a lot of folks involved in preservation that might be outside of our publishing unit, especially being within a library. We lean on the library a lot to help us with these things. So I wanted to have that section that kind of outlines who's involved in these decisions. Obviously, our digital preservation coordinator, since this is probably the 5th time I'm mentioning her in this presentation, was number 1 on that list. I also included our metadata services team in the library, since we are talking about working with that descriptive and administrative and technical metadata. Our IT services, more specifically, if we're getting into the back end of any of our projects, we might need to work with them. And then our repository managers. So we have kind of 3 main repositories at Virginia Tech. We have our institutional repository, VTech Works. We have our Virginia Tech data repository. And then we have a new up and coming tool called the Digital Library Platform. It's important to note that I know that just because we put our materials in there, that doesn't necessarily mean they're preserved, but they might have their own preservation processes for materials that are deposited into these systems. So having an understanding of what those might be, and if that's enough, or if we need to go kind of beyond that, is helpful. And then also thinking about our publishing team and what are the responsibilities of our publishing team on this. Obviously, I just mentioned we're relying on all these other folks within our library, but what are the responsibilities of our team? In this particular case, it's selecting and managing that content for preservation. We want to promote those good practices and best practices as much as possible. Kind of keeping track of those workflows, making sure that they're still going through, and so on. The last 2 sections, I did actually cut out a couple of sections from the original NASIG model preservation, but the last 2 sections that I chose to include in our policy specifically were that framework and administration review cycle. So the framework kind of helps this section specifically kind of helps us know, okay, when was this specific policy made effective, and how often are we going to review it? If changes to processes and workflows happen over the next year or so, we'll obviously update it as needed. But if no changes are happening that we're aware of, then we'll just make sure we review it every 5 years or so to align with any changes that might be happening that we're unaware of. So this kind of forces us to go through this process of talking to folks again, at least every 5 years, maybe even in between them. And this last section, again, going with that idea of linking out when possible, is for related documents. So we have our VTP specific documentation, our publishing specific documentation. Currently, that's just our guiding philosophy and strategy plan. But I could see other documents going in there in the future. And then we also have our VTUL, our Virginia Tech University Library, preservation documents. I know they are in the process right now of kind of migrating off of Confluence to another system. So these links will change. So that will be a time when this policy changes, even just to update those links. But kind of, again, using their existing policies to just say, this is what we're going to rely on here with our department and what we're publishing. So then thinking about next steps. So I've got this first draft or section of this preservation policy. What I'm looking at now and what I'm working with our preservation coordinator on is ensuring that all of these pieces are actually happening. So is everything that we're saying is being crawled by our web crawler for web archives? Are those things all being crawled? Are things being deposited into AP Trust or clocks or wherever? So making sure that all of that is happening, and then looking at the activities that are happening, and then looking at what we've scoped out as what needs to be preserved from our policy, what gaps are left. I can say one for sure that I know of off the top of my head are going to be those contracts and MOUs. Right now, those are all in Google, Google Drive, but where can we put those that might be a better preservation environment? And then last but not least, continuing to revisit and revise this policy as we kind of go through these steps. And so at this time, I'm going to throw my email out there one last time. If anybody has questions or wants to give me feedback, I'd really appreciate it. But if you all have questions, feel free to jump in now. Thank you so much.